Imagine a moment so tense, so utterly pivotal, that the fate of a nation hangs by a single thread. A moment where billions of dollars could either usher in an era of prosperity or seal a new form of servitude. This is not just a story, it's a testament to courage, intuition, and the quiet heroism found in unexpected places. What you are about to read is a dramatic revelation, a deep dive into the high-stakes world of international politics and hidden agendas. If you believe in the power of truth and the fight for sovereignty, you won't want to miss a single word. So, as we embark on this gripping narrative, take a moment to subscribe, hit that like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because this is the story of Ibrahim Traoré and how a single clause on page 178 stopped a global powerhouse in its tracks. The Grand Conference Hall of Ouagadougou's newly renovated International Summit Center buzzed with an almost palpable anticipation. A symphony of murmurs, the soft click of camera lenses, and the hushed urgency of international media outlets filled the air. Representatives from major global news agencies positioned their cameras strategically, eager to capture what was being heralded as the investment deal of the decade, a landmark agreement promising to reshape the economic landscape of Burkina Faso. The air shimmered with the collective belief that, after years of struggling against what many perceived as Western economic exploitation, this West African nation had finally found a more equitable partner in the East. At one end of the massive, polished mahogany table sat Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. For this momentous occasion, his usual military fatigues had been replaced by a simple yet strikingly elegant African prince suit, its deep earth tones speaking of his connection to his homeland. His demeanor was outwardly calm, a study in quiet resolve, but beneath the composed exterior, a keen intelligence was at work, observing every nuance. At the opposing end, radiating an air of formidable confidence, was Wei Jiang, the imposing CEO of China's Prosperity Mining Consortium. He was flanked by a team of impeccably dressed executives and legal advisors, their faces an inscrutable mask of professional assurance. Economy Minister Kabori, beaming with triumph, stepped forward to address the assembled press, his voice swelling with pride. This $4.8 billion investment, he announced, will transform Burkina Faso's economy. The development of our nation's lithium reserves represents a historic opportunity for our people. The mood was undeniably celebratory. The publicly announced terms of the deal seemed remarkably favorable: significant Chinese investment in critical infrastructure, promises of advanced technology transfer, guarantees of local employment, and most impressively, a 60/40 profit-sharing arrangement heavily in Burkina Faso's favor. On paper, it was a dream come true, a beacon of hope for a nation long exploited. As the formal proceedings began, thick documents, nearly 200 pages each, were distributed around the table. Months of arduous negotiations were encapsulated within their dense legal language. Traoré's legal team had reviewed the agreement multiple times, and his economic advisors were practically effervescent with enthusiasm. "Mr. President, this truly is a watershed moment," whispered Finance Minister Urigo, his voice thick with emotion. "With this investment, we can build schools, hospitals, modernize our military. Our people will finally see the benefits of our natural resources." Traoré nodded, feigning agreement, but an invisible seed of unease had already taken root in his mind. He couldn't shake the sensation that something was amiss. His hands, resting on the formidable contract before him, began to tremble ever so slightly, a tremor known only to him, as he fixated on the national security clause, rereading it for the third time, a growing suspicion mirroring the barely perceptible fear he had glimpsed in the eyes of his young translator, Issa Kanadi. The seeds of Traoré's suspicion had been planted 3 weeks earlier, not in a bustling conference hall, but during a private dinner at the presidential palace. The setting was intimate, the air rich with the aromas of traditional Burkinab cuisine, succulent riz grass and tender brochettes served on ornate platters. Traoré, hosting his Chinese counterpart, Wei Jiang, had found the conversation amicable, almost convivial. They spoke of potential, of shared prosperity, of a new era of cooperation between nations. Yet, amidst the polite exchanges, Wei Jiang made a comment that struck Traoré as profoundly odd. Your lithium reserves, WEI had mused, his gaze distant, as if envisioning a vast, subterranean empire, are among the purest in the world. With proper management, they could sustain operations for generations to come. It wasn't the content of Wee's statement that pricked Traoré's attention. It was the subtle, almost imperceptible emphasis on the word generations. The ongoing negotiations centered on a 25-year agreement, a substantial duration by any measure, but Wee's intonation suggested something far grander, more enduring, perhaps even limitless. When Traoré, ever observant, had subtly questioned this, WEI had quickly, almost too quickly, backtracked, dismissing it as a mere translation issue. The incident passed, seemingly forgotten, yet the faint echo of that emphasized word lingered in Traoré's mind, a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious evening. Later that evening, after the last of the Chinese delegation had departed, and the palace had settled into a quiet hum, Kennedy had approached Traoré privately. The young translator, usually composed and professional, seemed uncharacteristically tense, his eyes darting nervously. Sir, Kennedy had begun, his voice barely above a whisper. When Mr. WEI mentioned generations, he used a specific Mandarin term. It implies perpetual control, not merely a long-term arrangement. It's a term often reserved for concepts of lasting lineage or dynastic continuation, far beyond a fixed contractual period. Kennedy, educated in Beijing and fluent in Mandarin, was one of the few people in Burkina Faso capable of understanding the nuanced private conversations of the Chinese delegation. His revelation, delivered with quiet urgency, transformed Traoré's vague unease into a sharp, cold certainty that something was indeed very wrong. From that night forward, Traoré had instructed Kennedy to embark on a silent, meticulous investigation. The young translator was to pay particular attention to any discrepancies, however subtle, between what was being said in Mandarin during subsequent private meetings and what was being subsequently translated into French for the official records. Every phrase, every turn of speech was to be scrutinized. Simultaneously, Traoré ordered an even more thorough review of all contract drafts, not just by his legal team, but by a select, trusted few, including himself. It was a painstaking process. Each revision of the voluminous document seemed, on the surface, to address previous concerns, subtly adjusting wording here, adding clarification there. Yet, with each apparent improvement, new, vaguely worded clauses or shifts in syntax seemed to quietly embed themselves, like tiny, almost invisible parasites, hinting at deeper, more sinister implications. These were not errors, Traoré now understood. They were deliberate, strategic insertions designed to be overlooked or misunderstood by those not privy to the precise nuances of intent. Now, as the ceremonial speeches continued to drone on, a polite facade for the monumental deal about to be struck, Traoré's focus was unwavering. He opened the massive contract again, his thumb instinctively finding the familiar heft of page 178, flipping directly to section 17, which dealt with national security and resource protection. Something about its wording had struck him as odd. During his last review, a subtle discord in the legal symphony that his trained ear had caught. The clause stipulated that Chinese security personnel would be stationed at the mining sites to protect their investment, a seemingly standard provision in such large-scale agreements. But there was a subsection, tucked away discreetly, that referenced Appendix F, containing additional security protocols. This was the thread he needed to pull, while WEI Zhang, across the table, delivered a polished speech about mutual prosperity and the burgeoning friendship between China and Africa. Traoré quietly, almost imperceptibly, turned to Appendix F. What he found hidden within its dense, labyrinthine legal language made his blood run cold. It was far beyond additional protocols. A provision lay exposed, granting Chinese security forces extraterritorial jurisdiction not merely at the mining sites themselves, but astonishingly, within a 50-kilometer radius around them. Moreover, these forces would possess the chilling authority to neutralize threats to the mining operation without requiring approval from Burkina Faso authorities. With the planned mining site strategically located near vital military installations and major cities, this effectively created sprawling, self-governing Chinese security zones across critical areas of the country, bypassing the very sovereignty Trao had sworn to protect. Traor's hands, which had trembled subtly earlier, now clenched, the slight tremor intensifying as he read further. The appendix also included insidious provisions for automatic contract renewal, which would be triggered under certain vaguely defined emergency conditions. This was the perpetual control Kennedy had warned him about, disguised in legalese, essentially allowing the Chinese company to extend their dominion indefinitely. He thought back, with a bitter pang, to the fate of his predecessor, former President Dimba. Dimba had signed several seemingly innocuous agreements with foreign powers, only to be ousted when the true, devastating costs of those deals became apparent to a disillusioned military and an enraged citizenry. Trao himself had risen to power on a wave of popular support, promising to restore Burkina Faso's sovereignty over its own resources. Would he now, moments before signing, betray that sacred promise for what appeared to be short-term economic gain? The weight of history and the future pressed down on him. His internal turmoil was abruptly interrupted by a discreet vibration from his phone. Glancing down, he saw a message from Colonel Wedriogo, his loyal head of military intelligence. Urgent. Chinese military attaché already discussing permanent base locations with Defense Minister Zongo. Intercepted communications suggest 5,000 plus security personnel planned. The message, stark and unambiguous, confirmed his absolute worst fears. The mining deal wasn't just an exploitative economic agreement. It was a Trojan horse, a cunning pretext for establishing a permanent, large-scale Chinese military presence in Burkina Faso. This was a country that had only recently, and with immense struggle, managed to reduce French military influence after decades of post-colonial control. The very idea of exchanging one foreign overlord for another, even a supposedly equitable partner, was an unbearable affront to his nation's hard-won independence. Mr. President, Kabore's voice, a sudden, sharp intrusion, broke through Traor's concentration. They're waiting for your remarks before the signing. Traor looked up, meeting the expectant gaze of all eyes in the hall. The Chinese delegation, led by Wei Jiang, smiled expectantly, their faces radiating an almost predatory calm. Cameras were poised, ready to immortalize this historic moment for consumption by global audiences. But as Traor's gaze flickered to Kennedy, he caught a nearly imperceptible shake of the head from his young translator, a final, silent confirmation that his suspicions were valid. Rising slowly to his feet, Traor returned Wei Jiang's smile. Warmly, a gesture of cordiality that masked the tempest raging within. This is indeed a historic day, he began, his voice measured and calm, betraying no hint of the turmoil that had just consumed him. For too long, Africa's resources have enriched others, while our people remain in poverty. Today, we hope to begin a new chapter in how resource agreements are structured. Wei Jiang nodded enthusiastically, a flicker of self-satisfaction crossing his features. But that flicker froze almost imperceptibly as Trao continued, his tone shifting, steel replacing velvet. Partnerships, Trao said, picking up his copy of the contract, require transparency and mutual respect. I find it interesting that the Mandarin version of our agreement contains several, shall we say, elaborations that are not present in the French text. A ripple of unease spread through the room. The silence deepened, becoming heavy, palpable. Wei Jiang's smile was now completely gone, replaced by a rigid mask. His translator began speaking rapidly into his ear, a torrent of hushed Mandarin, but the businessman's expression had already hardened. There must be some misunderstanding, Wei said smoothly, composing himself with an unnerving swiftness. Translation errors, perhaps. We can clarify these minor technical issues after the signing ceremony. Minor technical issues? Trao repeated, raising an eyebrow, his voice still cordial but now laced with an undeniable edge. I would not consider granting foreign troops jurisdiction on Burkina Faso soil a minor issue, Mr. Wei, or why the emergency provisions would allow this contract to be extended indefinitely without our consent. The Chinese delegation erupted. In a frantic chorus of hurried whispers, their composed fad cracking under the sudden, unexpected pressure. Wei Jiang's demeanor shifted subtly, his friendly expression giving way to something colder, more calculating. President Trao, he began, leaning forward, his voice losing its earlier pretense of equality. With respect, your country needs this investment. Your lithium reserves are worthless without the capital and technology to develop them. Perhaps you're overthinking certain standard protective clauses. Trao maintained his composure, though he noted how quickly WEI had dropped. The polite charade. Standard protective clauses, he countered, his voice steady, that happen to be hidden in appendices and differ between language versions of the contract. WEI Zhang leaned further forward, his eyes narrowing. Let me be direct, Mr. President. My company has invested considerable resources in preparing this project. The Chinese government has authorized special economic assistance packages contingent on this agreement. Walking away now would be unwise for Burkina Faso's future. The threat, though thinly veiled, hung heavy in the air. Trao could see his own ministers shifting uncomfortably. Minister Kabori was visibly sweating, while Finance Minister Urigo stared fixedly at the table, pointedly avoiding eye contact. Trao's gaze didn't waver. I don't think so, Mr. WEI. What I'm looking at isn't a translation error. It's a deliberate attempt to secure control over not just our lithium, but our sovereignty. With a decisive, deliberate movement, he closed the massive contract and placed it back on the table. His voice, though calm, now carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. Let me be clear. Burkina Faso welcomes investment partners, but we will not trade our independence for development funds. Not to Western powers, and not to China either. The conference room erupted in chaos. Journalists, sensing a seismic shift, rushed to file breaking stories, their cameras flashing wildly. The Chinese delegation huddled in urgent, furious consultation. Burkina Faso ministers looked at each other in a mixture of confusion, alarm, and dawning realization. As security personnel moved swiftly to clear the room, Trao beckoned Kanadi to follow him to a side chamber. Once alone, the president turned to the young translator, his face etched with a grim determination. Tell me everything, he said. Simply, Konate's words came in a rush, a torrent of suppressed information finally unleashed. They've been planning this for months, sir. I overheard their legal team discussing it last week. They called it strategic expansion through contractual means. The security provisions were designed to establish a permanent Chinese presence, and there's more that isn't even in the contract. Plans to bring in thousands of Chinese workers, rather than hiring locally. Secret agreements with certain ministers. Which ministers? Trao asked sharply, his voice cutting through Konate's rapid explanation. Kanadi hesitated for a fraction of a second, then, taking a deep breath, revealed the names that confirmed Trao's worst fears of internal betrayal. Minister Kabori and Finance Minister Urigo. They were promised significant personal compensation for ensuring the deal went through without scrutiny. Trao absorbed this devastating betrayal in silence, his jaw tight. Then he asked, "Why didn't you come to me sooner, Issa?" "I was gathering evidence," Kanadi said, pulling out a small, discreet recording device. "I have their conversations." In their private discussions, they referred to this as the new colonization, economic control without the political backlash of military occupation. Before Trao could respond, his security chief burst into the room, his face urgent. "Sir, the Chinese delegation is threatening to withdraw all existing investments and projects. Minister Kabori is insisting you reconsider your position." "I imagine he is," Trao said quietly, a cold fire in his eyes. He stood for a moment in thought, then straightened his shoulders, the weariness momentarily banished by a surge of purpose. "Have the full cabinet assembled in 1 hour, and place Ministers Kabori and Urigo under house arrest pending investigation for corruption." The security chief looked startled, but nodded sharply and left to carry out his orders. "What now, Mr. President?" Kanadi asked, the gravity of their situation sinking in. "Without this investment, we'll find other partners," Trao interrupted, his voice resolute, "or develop these resources ourselves, even if it takes longer. What we won't do is exchange Western colonizers for Eastern ones." He picked up Konate's recording device. "Make copies of this. We're going to address the nation tonight. Our people deserve to know when their sovereignty has been defended and when it has been traded away by those meant to protect it." As they prepared to leave the room, Kanadi asked hesitantly, "Sir, aren't you concerned about China's reaction? Their economic influence in Africa is enormous." Trao paused at the door, turning back. "Of course, I am. But there's something all these great powers fail to understand about nations like ours. After centuries of colonization and exploitation, we've learned that true independence is worth more than development that comes with hidden chains. The following hours were among the most intense of Traoré's presidency. The Chinese embassy issued an immediate, furious condemnation of what they termed baseless accusations and diplomatic discourtesy, while economic advisers presented dire forecasts of retaliatory measures that could devastate Burkina Faso's already fragile economy. Several cabinet ministers, their faces pale with fear, threatened resignation, claiming Traoré was sacrificing development for ideological posturing. But Traoré, standing firm against the gale of opposition, remained. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Despite economic concerns, citizens poured into the streets in jubilant support. National pride surged as Traoré's speech was shared across social media platforms and broadcast throughout the region. What might have been a political disaster instead became a rallying point for national unity, a defiant roar against neocolonialism. International reaction was swift and mixed. Western nations, which had been steadily losing influence in Africa to Chinese investment, now expressed hypocritical concern about Burkina Faso's economic stability. China issued formal denials of any impropriety, dismissing the recordings as fabrications, but across Africa, something far more significant was happening. Within weeks, leaders from Ghana, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo had requested copies of the rejected contract to compare with their own Chinese agreements. A movement for transparency in international resource deals was gaining undeniable momentum. Several nations discovered similar hidden clauses in their own contracts and promptly began renegotiation processes. The economic consequences for Burkina Faso were initially harsh. Chinese investments in other sectors were frozen, and Western institutions, seeing an opportunity to regain influence, offered loans with their own problematic conditions attached. Traoré rejected these as well, instead turning to regional partnerships and alternative funding sources. In a surprising development, a consortium of South American lithium-producing nations, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, reached out to offer technical assistance and potential investment partnerships based on their own experiences balancing resource development with sovereignty. Unlike previous foreign investors, they proposed genuine technology transfer and training programs that would build Burkina Faso's independent capacity. 3 months after the failed signing ceremony, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the edge of a massive construction site. Using reserve funds and a consortium of smaller, ethical investors from Brazil, India, and African nations, Burkina Faso had begun development of its lithium resources independently. "It will take longer this way," explained the new finance minister, surveying the bustling activity below, "but every job is filled by a Burkina citizen. Every franc of profit stays in our economy." Traoré nodded, watching as local workers operated machinery with "Made in Burkina Faso" prominently displayed on its side, part of a parallel investment in domestic manufacturing. The path had not been easy. There had been food shortages when Chinese agricultural investments were withdrawn. Power outages became more frequent as infrastructure projects were suspended. Opposition politicians, some financially linked to foreign interests, had attempted to capitalize on these hardships to push for Traoré's removal. Yet the Burkina people had proven remarkably resilient. Community cooperatives formed to address food security issues. Engineering students developed innovative solutions to power problems. Most importantly, a new sense of national purpose had emerged, a collective understanding that true development required sacrifice but promised genuine independence. "Mr. President," a young aide approached. "President Ningguo of Congo-Brazzaville is on the secure line. He's facing a similar situation with a Chinese oil contract and requests your advice." As Traoré walked back to take the call, he reflected on how a single careful reading of a contract and the courage to walk away from billions had not only protected his nation's sovereignty but sparked a continental re-examination of resource agreements. The call with President Ningguo lasted over an hour, with Traoré sharing detailed insights from Burkina Faso's experience. As they concluded, Ningguo asked a question that gave Traoré pause: "How did you find the strength to walk away from so much money when your country needs it so desperately?" Traoré considered this carefully before responding. "I remembered something my father told me when I was a boy. He was a simple farmer who lost his land to a foreign agricultural company. He said, they offered us jobs on the land that was once ours and called it progress. I decided that true progress means owning our future, not just working for someone else's." In the conference room, before connecting the call, he glanced at the framed document on the wall, a simple statement in his own handwriting that had become something of a mantra for his administration: development without dignity is just another form of poverty. 6 months later, Burkina Faso hosted the first Pan-African Resource Sovereignty Summit, bringing together leaders from across the continent to develop common approaches to resource management. The lithium project was progressing steadily, with the first processing facility nearing completion. More importantly, a new generation of Burkina engineers and technicians was being trained to operate it. The real wealth of a nation, Traoré had learned, wasn't measured solely in investment dollars or GDP growth, but in its capacity to determine its own future, free from hidden clauses and foreign control. It was a lesson that had nearly cost Burkina Faso its sovereignty, but instead became its greatest strength. As he welcomed African leaders to the summit, Traoré reflected on the Chinese proverb Wei Jiang had quoted during their negotiations: "If you want to be rich for a year, grow grain. If you want to be rich for 10 years, grow trees. If you want to be rich for a lifetime, grow people." The irony wasn't lost on him. By rejecting the quick path to wealth, Burkina Faso was investing in something far more valuable: the capacity of its people to control their own destiny. That was a wealth no hidden clause could ever take. The fight for true independence is never easy, but as Ibrahim Traoré showed us, it is always worth it. This story is a powerful reminder that vigilance, integrity, and unwavering commitment to one's nation can change the course of history. If you are inspired by Traoré's courage and the spirit of sovereignty, please like this story, share it with those who need to hear it, and comment below with your thoughts on what true development means to you. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales of resilience and leadership.